The diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum are the topics of this screencast. These topics may be found in Chapter 7 of your textbook. The objectives of this screencast are as follows. Describe the location of the diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. Describe the functions of the various structures or parts of the brain presented in the screencast. A summary of these structures or parts and their functions will be provided by the instructor. The next region of the brain that we will now discuss is the diencephalon, which is shown in purple in this figure. The diencephalon is completely surrounded by the cerebrum in the same manner that a mushroom cap surrounds the top of the stem of a mushroom. You can really only see the diencephalon by dissecting the brain. The diencephalon is composed of three parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. I often tell students to think thalamus, thalamus, and more thalamus when you think of the diencephalon. It is often difficult to really visualize the components of the diencephalon, so let's relate the different components of the diencephalon to the third ventricle, since the diencephalon surrounds the third ventricle. So here we're looking at a sagittal view of the brain. Here's the third ventricle. So if the third ventricle was a box or a room, the epithalamus would be the ceiling. The thalamus would be the lateral walls, if you will, of that room, and the floor would be the hypothalamus. Let's first discuss the function of the thalamus. We're looking at a sagittal section of the brain. We're going to use the third ventricle as our point of reference, which is shown here in light blue. The thalamus is lateral to the third ventricle. The thalamus transfers impulses that ascend the spinal cord and the brainstem to the appropriate part of the cerebral cortex for interpretation and integration. Let's now look at another part of the diencephalon, the hypothalamus. We're going to use the third ventricle again as a point of reference. The thalamus is lateral to the third ventricle. Hypo means below, so the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. It is the area shaded in purple in this figure. The hypothalamus is an important control center of autonomic nervous system function. It contains three important autonomic nervous system centers. It is the body's thermostat, regulating body temperature. It also controls water balance, ensuring that no more water leaves the body than enters the body. And it also regulates metabolism, the sum of all the chemical reactions that occur in the body. Since many of those chemical reactions release heat, its role in regulating metabolism is very much related to its role in regulating body temperature. Attached to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, and it hangs from the hypothalamus like a small grape. The hypothalamus secretes hormones which regulates the activity of the pituitary gland. In fact, the hypothalamus regulates body temperature through the pituitary gland. Also attached to the hypothalamus is the mammillary body. The mammillary body contains reflex centers that are involved in smelling or olfaction. While we're talking about the hypothalamus, I do want to take a moment to discuss the limbic system. The limbic system is the portions of the brain that are grouped together and sometimes referred to as the emotional visceral brain. It includes some structures of the cerebrum, the diencephalon, as well as the brain stem. Certain stimuli can result in the production of emotional responses that we are aware of, as well as unconscious, involuntary responses that we are not. For example, we're in the woods, we hear a bear growl, and we become frightened. That's an emotion. At the same time, our heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases, and blood vessels to our skeletal muscles dilate. That is an involuntary physiological response to the same stimulus. The emotional response appears to be contributed by the cerebral cortex, while the autonomic response in the example given appears to be the result of the activity of the diencephalon and the brainstem. Some scientists include the hypothalamus as part of the limbic system since it plays a role in the feeling or emotion of thirst and appetite, as well as sex drive, the perception of pleasure, and the perception of pain. The last portion of the diencephalon we are now going to discuss is the epithalamus. Again, we're going to use the third ventricle as our point of reference. Epi means upon, so the epithalamus is upon or above the third ventricle. The epithalamus includes the pineal gland or pineal body, which secretes the hormone melatonin in the absence of light, and this helps to maintain our daily sleeping cycles. When you get jet lag after a long flight, it's because there is a mismatch between melatonin secretion and the actual daylight hours. The other structure of the epithalamus is the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is a knot of capillaries and associated ependymal cells that produces cerebrospinal fluid in the third ventricle. The third region of the brain is the brainstem, shown in green. I suspect it's called the brainstem because it very much looks like a stem. If you thought of the cerebrum as a mushroom cap, the brainstem looks very much like a stem. The brainstem consists of three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The brainstem is shown here in green. The midbrain is the most superior portion of the brainstem, the portion closest to the diencephalon. The brainstem in general is composed of fiber tracts which send nerve impulses to and from the brain. Two prominent bulging fiber tracts are the cerebral peduncles. They send motor impulses from the brain down toward the spinal cord and sensory impulses from the spinal cord toward the higher portions of the brain. Another structure of the midbrain is the corpora quadrigemina. The corpora quadrigemina consists of four rounded protrusions. This is a sagittal view, so you can only see two of the four. I often tell students you can easily identify it because it looks like a peduncadunk or a butt. This structure contains reflex centers for vision and hearing, your ability to track an object in your visual field, as well as the startle reflex, which is the reflex that's responsible for your ability to quickly turn your head when you hear a sudden noise. The centers for those reflexes are found in the corpora quadrigemina. The second part of the brainstem I'd like to discuss is the pons. The pons is a very round part of the brainstem, and it reminds me of an Adam's apple. So I often refer to the pons as the Adam's apple of the brain. Pons literally means bridge. It contains fiber tracts which connect the spinal cord to the diencephalon, the spinal cord to the cerebellum to the diencephalon. The pons also contains nuclei that are involved in the control of breathing, or at least an aspect of the control of breathing. The medulla oblongata is the most inferior portion of the brainstem as well as the brain itself. It connects directly with the spinal cord. Every impulse that travels from the spinal cord to the brain, or from the brain to the spinal cord, must cross the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata also contains some very important control centers. The control centers for heart rate and blood pressure regulation are found in the medulla oblongata. A portion of breathing control is also found in the medulla oblongata. Breathing is controlled by the medulla oblongata in concert with the pons. The involuntary portion of swallowing as well as vomiting are both controlled by centers in the medulla oblongata. So the next time you vomit or call Earl or blow chunks, you can thank your beloved medulla oblongata. While the brainstem is composed mainly of fiber tracts of white matter, there are little masses of gray matter scattered throughout certain portions of the brain stem, and this is called the reticular formation. These nuclei consist of both sensory neurons as well as motor neurons, which communicate somewhat broadly with different parts of the cerebral cortex. The purple area in this figure represents the reticular formation. It is believed to be involved in motor control of many visceral organs. There is a specific portion of the reticular formation called the reticular activating system that also plays a role in sleep-awake cycles and consciousness. The final region of the brain is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is very similar in some respects to the cerebrum. Like the cerebrum, the cerebellum consists of two hemispheres. Like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has an outer cortex of gray matter overlying white matter. And the gray matter is thrown into grooves and ridges in a manner similar to the cerebral cortex. The function of the cerebellum is to provide for precise timing of skeletal muscle activity in order to enable control of balance and equilibrium. So there is an involuntary part of voluntary body movements that most of us are unaware of. To understand the role that the cerebellum plays in body movements, let me give you an example. Close your eyes and then take your fingers and point to your left and right, and then bring your fingers in front of you and touch them together. You can do that without any problem, as long as you're not drunk. And this is because even though you can't see your fingers, you do have an idea where your fingers and hands and arms are in space, even if you can't see them. It is the cerebellum that's responsible for that. Individuals who have damage to their cerebellum have a problem bringing their fingers together with their eyes closed. Individuals with a damaged cerebellum also have problems walking in a very coordinated fashion. They exhibit what's called ataxia, where they sort of stumble around. What does this also remind you of? It should remind you of someone who is drunk or inebriated. People who are inebriated have problems maintaining balance, also bringing their fingers together with their eyes closed, as well as walking in a coordinated fashion. This is because consumption of alcohol, excessive consumption of alcohol, inhibits the normal functioning of the cerebellum. This table that I have provided to you on Blackboard summarizes the various structures and the functions that you should know. Let's now review the objectives of the screencast. Describe the location of the diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. Describe the functions of the various structures or parts of the brain presented in the screencast. The topic of the next screencast will be protection of the nervous system.